A very good afternoon, students. Welcome to this new video on to the bones of the nasal cavity. I will just deal with the various bones which forms the various walls of the nasal cavity. There is a medial wall and a lateral wall of the nasal cavity. If you see this diagram, this is a coronal section passing through the skeleton of the face. On the top is the anterocranial fossa, and then there are two openings of the orbits are seen here, and on the medial side of both the orbit there is this dark red color area, and this is the bone called as the ethmoid bone. If you will see lower down or below that of the orbital cavity, then you will see there is a large cavity seen in the maxilla. These are the maxillary air sinuses, and then these are the maxillary teeth. So I hope that you must have got the orientation for the coronal section which is passing through the facial skeleton. Now I will trace the boundary of the nasal cavity. This is the roof of the nasal cavity, which is formed by the cribriform plate of ethmoid, and then this is the lateral boundary of the nasal cavity. This is the floor of the nasal cavity where pointer is moving. Again, then this is the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. You will see that bony projections from the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, they are projecting inside the right and left nasal cavity, because this cavity is divided into right and left side by the passage of a bony plate, what is called as the median nasal septum, and this plate, bony septum, is formed by above by that of the ethmoid bone, and the bone ethmoid which is present in midline plate, it is called as the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Lower down it is formed by a separate bone called as the vomer bone. Thus two bones are forming the median wall, I mean to say the midline structure or median nasal septum, perpendicular plate of ethmoid above and the vomer below. And then in the lateral wall you will also see the part of the ethmoid bone where chambers like structures are present. They are ethmoidal air sinuses, and you can also see the two bony projection hanging in the nasal cavity. These are the conchae. This is the superior nasal concha, this is the middle nasal concha. Similarly, from in the lower part also a bony projection is hanging, that is a separate bone, and it is the called as the inferior nasal concha. This is the right and this is the left. This is the right nasal cavity and this is the left nasal cavity. I think that you have got a fairly good idea about the nasal cavity situation. Let us come to see first to the median nasal septum, or that partition which divides into right and left nasal cavities. This, as I said, in the midline it is formed by above by the perpendicular plate of ethmoid, and lower down it is formed by the vomer bone. But anteriorly the gap between these two bones is not formed by the bone, but it is formed by the cartilage, which is known as the septal cartilage. Thus the median nasal septum is a structure which is partly bony and partly cartilaginous. Posteriorly you can see this cavity, and this is a paranasal air sinus called as the sphenoidal air sinus. Similarly, a bony sinus is present in the frontal bone, and this is the frontal air sinus is seen here. The bottom of the nasal cavity, or the floor of the nasal cavity, is formed mainly by the maxillary bone, its palatine process, and the palatine horizontal plate of the palatine bone more posteriorly. Okay. Now we will see the formation or structure of the lateral wall of the nose. This diagram shows the bones which are forming the lateral wall of the nose on one side, and then you can see most anteriorly this Lateral wall is formed by cartilaginous, which are the part of the alar cartilage. Then on the top of this, the first bone which forms this lateral wall is the nasal plate. Then behind that is the maxilla, which is a large bone is here, maxilla. You can see this process of maxilla going upward toward the frontal bone is called as the frontal process of the maxilla. And then this is the palatine process of the maxilla is there, which is posteriorly it is articulating with this dirty yellow color bone, which is a perpendicular plate of the palatine bone. Then in this pink color, some bony projections are seen. This upper two projection are the part of the ethmoid bone, and the upper projection is called as the superior concha, and the middle projection is called as the middle nasal concha. Then there is another bony projection which is lower down, and this is the inferior nasal concha. But inferior nasal concha, though here is shown in the same color, but it is a separate bone, not the part of the ethmoid bone. Posterior to this palatine process or perpendicular plate of the palatine bone, there is a plate is seen, and this is the medial pterygoid plate, okay, and behind the lateral pterygoid plate is also seen. Now I hope that you have understood that the lateral wall of the nose is formed by many bone, starting from that of the this bone nasal plate, going to the maxilla, to the ethmoid, to the inferior concha bone, to that of the perpendicular plate of the palatine, and to that more posteriorly it is by the medial pterygoid plate, though it is not the proper part of the nasal cavity, but posteriorly it extends nasal cavity to the nasopharynx extent. Now, just to show you that these bony projections, which are called as concha, superior concha, middle concha and inferior, deep to which you can see the presence of the grooves are there, and they are quite deep groove, and if we will cut this concha, superior, middle and inferior concha, then we will see the spaces, and these spaces are called as the meatus. So in the next diagram I will show you the meatus and what are the different paranasal air sinus they open in the lateral wall of the nose. Just see this diagram, and this is that nasal cavity covered by the mucous membrane. Here it is not bony, it is covered by the bones are covered by mucous membrane. Here is the frontal bone which is showing the frontal air sinus. This is the sphenoid bone showing the sphenoidal air sinus, and here it is the anterior nasal opening is there, and this dilated space just above the anterior nasal opening, which is lined by the mucous membrane, is called as atrium. Now these three bony projection which we have seen, which are here covered by the mucous membrane, they are the superior, middle and the inferior nasal concha, and deep to it these grooves which are seen, they are deep spaces and they are called as the meatuses. This opening is the opening of the pharyngotympanic tube which connect the nasopharynx. This part is nasopharynx behind the nasal cavity to that of the middle ear cavity, to the middle. This is the soft palate. Now I will tell you that after cutting this nasal concha, what projections we get, I mean say what openings of the paranasal air sinus we see in the lateral wall of the nose. Let us see here, we have cut all these concha here, superior concha cut, middle concha cut and inferior concha cut, and all these spaces deep to it which are seen, they are the meatuses. See, this sphenoidal air sinus is not opening in any meatus, but it is opening just above and behind the superior concha in the sphenoethmoidal recess, okay. But after cutting the superior concha, we can see that there is opening of the posterior ethmoidal air cells, chambers which we have seen in the lateral wall of the nose in ethmoid bone. When we cut the middle concha, then many things can be seen here. here is opening of the middle ethmoidal air sac in this bulging, and this bulging is called as bulla ethmoidale or ethmoidal bulla. And then deep to this bulla or bulging there is a semilunar space, and this semilunar space is called as hiatus semilunaris, in which many air sinuses they open most anteriorly. This frontal air sinus, you can see here, this probe is going into the frontal air of the frontal air sinus into the anteriormost part of the hiatus semilunaris, but in the middle part there is opening of the posterior ethmoidal air sinus, while in the posteriormost large area there is opening of the maxillary air sinus. Then if you see the opening deep to that of the in the inferior meatus, deep to inferior concha, then you will see that most anteriorly there is opening of the nasolacrimal duct, which brings the tears from the lacrimal sac. So it is not the opening of the any air sinuses, it is the opening of the nasolacrimal duct which drains the tear into the nasal cavity. I hope that you have understood the opening of the paranasal air sinus and the nasal, I mean say, and the opening of the lacrimal duct into the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. For this I have used the grant atlas, okay, and this grant I am thankful to the publisher, the Walter Kluwer, for using this diagram. Similarly, I am also thankful to you for watching this video on the nasal